Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. This is a presentation hosted by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on submitting Discharge Monitoring Report Data, or DMR, for Vessel General Permit Annual Reports. We will be recording this presentation and posting the recording and slides to EPA's website as a way to share it with those who could not attend today. The agenda for today's webinar includes a presentation and responses to your questions. We are pleased to have so many of you with us today, and due to the number of attendees, we have muted all phone lines except the line of our presenter. During the webinar, we encourage you to type and submit questions as they come to you using the GoToWebinar control panel. On the control panel, you will see a bold heading titled Questions, and when you click the plus sign to expand the area, a text box will display for typing and submitting your questions to EPA staff. EPA staff will respond to the questions at the halfway point and then at the end of the presentation. We may not be able to get to all of your questions, but we will be reading them as they come in and provide as much information as possible. At the end of the webinar, we do have a survey that will appear on your screen requesting your feedback on today's presentation. Your input is very important to us, so we ask that you take a minute to fill that out at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jack Faulk of EPA's Office of Wastewater Management to begin the presentation.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on how to use EPA's electronic annual reporting system for preparing and filing discharge monitoring reports, otherwise known as DMRs. Glad you're able to join, and hopefully the webinar will be useful to you. For the webinar today, I'm going to first give a quick overview of the 2013 VGP DMR requirements, including a quick look at Appendix H of the permit, which is the paper copy of the annual report. I'll then give a really quick reminder of how to get into the ENOI system and get to the annual report page in that system. Then I'll talk about the DMR data required in the spreadsheet, and we'll walk through a few examples. After that, I'll remind you how to get the data uploaded, certified, and submitted to EPA. As Sarah mentioned, we'll have 2 breaks for questions about entering DMR data. We probably won't get to everyone's questions, but again, if you do have questions, you can send them to the email address that I've put on every screen, and then at the end I'll show you a couple other options that maybe will help you get your questions answered. Before I get into the details, I just want to remind everyone that last year we completed and posted a reference manual on how to collect and analyze samples as required under the 2013 permit. That guidance is available on our website, and while it doesn't discuss how to enter the data into the NOI system, it does help you identify the type of information you'll need to collect and how you'll need to collect it to be able to properly submit DMR data to EPA. A couple of weeks ago, we had a webinar on how to use the ENOI system to submit annual reports, and hopefully you were able to attend that or you've been able to get a copy of that. I apologize for not getting that a downloadable version posted on our website. We're working on it, and I was told that we'd have it posted by the end of this week, so we'll show you at the end the address to go to get a downloadable version. But for those of you that have registered, you'll also receive an email after the webinar today that contains a link to be able to watch or to send it to your colleague to watch a replay of the video. My assumption, though, for today's webinar is that you're familiar with how to register and log into the system and get to the annual report page and answer the basic annual report questions. I'm going to focus today on how to use the ENOI system to enter monitoring data. Specifically, the permit identifies 4 types of discharges for which monitoring may be required: bilge water, ballast water, gray water, and exhaust gas scrubber wash water. That being said, I do want to spend a few minutes to give a very general overview of the monitoring requirements of the permit, since there seems to be a fair amount of misunderstanding of which vessels are required to monitor and for what. I do want to stress, though, that I'm just going to give an overview. You really need to read the entire permit to determine the exact monitoring requirements that apply to your vessel. The bilge water monitoring requirements are contained in Part 2.2.2.1 of the permit and include 3 criteria for who has to monitor and submit DMR data. Namely, any new build vessels greater than 400 gross tons and that discharge bilge water into waters subject to the permit are required to monitor their bilge water and submit the results of that monitoring. The permit defines new build as any vessel built after December 19, 2013. And just to give you a perspective of kind of where I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, I did a quick search and 2,282 vessels indicated on their NOI that they were required to monitor bilge water. But of those more than 2,200 vessels, only 100 were actually new vessels constructed after December 19, 2013. So at least based on the NOIs, 95% of the vessels that thought they had to monitor for bilge water probably don't have to. Let me clarify, though. We did receive a question asking if the vessel was required to submit monitoring data if they were required to monitor bilge water for some other reason outside of the VGP. And the answer for that is no. You're only required to submit monitoring data for a discharge if the permit requires monitoring. To be clear, though, if the permit does require you to monitor that discharge for that vessel, then you must submit all monitoring data that you collected for that discharge, for which you use the sample collection and analysis requirements specified in the permit. There are a few considerations for bilge water monitoring that I want to mention. If analytical results are less than 5 parts per million for 2 consecutive years, future monitoring for bilge water is waived if you use an oil water separator that's capable of meeting 5 parts per million, or it uses an alarm that prevents a discharge greater than 5 ppm. You calibrate the oil content meter at least annually, and the oil content meter never exceeds 5 ppm during discharges into water subject to the permit. If you meet the waiver, you have to note that on the annual report, and the spreadsheet that I'm going to walk through does contain a field for making such notification. I'm not going to try and explain all the nuances of the ballast water monitoring requirements here, but we'll give you a very, very, very brief overview. Ballast water monitoring requirements apply to any vessel employing a ballast water treatment system and that discharges to water subject to the permit. Vessels required to monitor ballast water have to perform 3 different types of monitoring: biological monitoring, biocide monitoring, and functional monitoring. For biological monitoring, ballast water discharges must be monitored for total heterotrophic bacteria, E. coli, and enterococci. Biocide monitoring must be performed of the residual biocides and any biocide derivatives. And functional monitoring is required of physical and chemical properties of the treatment system being used for ballast water. The frequency of monitoring varies for the different types of monitoring and based on specifics of the vessel, but generally you have to perform biological monitoring 2 or 4 times in the first year, depending on whether high-quality data are available for the vessel treatment system, with the definition of high-quality data provided in the permit. For vessels that have high-quality data and that sample for 2 years and show results below the effluent limits, monitoring can be reduced to once a year thereafter. Biocide monitoring is required to be performed 3 to 5 times in the first 10 discharges, with the frequency again dependent on whether high-quality data are available. And finally, functional monitoring is to be performed at least monthly when the vessel is discharging ballast water in U.S. waters. Note that with all the monitoring, as I mentioned previously, where a vessel is required to monitor and monitors more frequently than required and uses methods specified in the permit to do so, then the results of that additional monitoring must also be submitted to EPA. This is particularly relevant to functional monitoring, where many of the parameters to be monitored are monitored continuously while the treatment system is operating. In those instances, EPA expects results of all that continuous functional monitoring to be submitted to EPA for the period when discharging in water subject to the permit. As you'll see, information such as that will be reported as minimum values, maximum values, and average values. Gray water monitoring requirements are included in parts 2.2.15.2 of the permit for all vessels, but there are also gray water monitoring requirements in parts 5.1.2 and 5.2.2 for large and medium cruise ships. The gray water monitoring requirements apply to any vessel that discharges gray water to water subject to the VGP, and for which any of the following also apply. 1. The vessel operates in the Great Lakes and is not a commercial vessel. 2. The vessel is a new build vessel that has a maximum crew capacity of at least 15 and overnight accommodations for that crew. Or 3. It's a large cruise ship. Or 4. It's a medium cruise ship that discharges gray water within 1 nautical mile of shore. Specific parameters to be monitored for gray water as follows. For cruise ships, biochemical oxygen demand, fecal coliform, suspended solids, pH, E. coli, total phosphorus, ammonia, nitrite, total Scheldal nitrogen, and in certain instances, total residual chlorine. Other vessels, BOD, fecal coliform, or E. coli, suspended solids, pH, and total residual chlorine. Again, the specifics are in the permit for your vessel. For cruise ships, vessels must perform initial monitoring 5 times over a 30-day period, and then must perform quarterly monitoring thereafter when discharging in water subject to the permit. Large cruise ships must perform annual monitoring even if they don't discharge in U.S. waters once a year, or else they'll have to reconduct initial monitoring when they return. Other vessels subject to gray water monitoring are required to monitor twice a year, with those samples collected at least 14 days apart. And the permit does provide a reduced monitoring frequency for fecal coliform or E. coli if the vessel has difficulty having the samples analyzed within the allowable holding times. A few other considerations to remember for gray water monitoring. You must note if gray water is mixed with other types of effluent, and be aware that cruise ship initial monitoring is the one set of monitoring in the permit that's not tied directly to the annual report, so you may actually have to submit the cruise ship initial monitoring outside of the annual report cycle. Our ENOI system does have a tool for allowing users to submit that information. And finally, the permit requires any vessel that discharges exhaust gas scrubber wash water into water subject to the permit to monitor. Monitoring includes data from continuous recording sensors as well as periodic sample collection and analysis. I'm not going to go through the list of pollutants that have to be monitored for sensors and periodic, other than it's a fairly extensive list for the periodic monitoring, and I'll show you a little bit later what that will look like. For sensors, they must be those pollutants have to be monitored continuously when discharging in water subject to the permit. And for the periodic monitoring, 2 initial samples must be collected in the first year of permit coverage or system operation, and then annually thereafter. A couple considerations for exhaust gas scrubber monitoring. Most importantly, periodic monitoring for the full list of parameters must be conducted at 3 different locations. 1, of the water at the inlet, at the scrubber inlet. 2, after the scrubber but before any treatment. And 3, at the discharge point from the vessel. Also, initial monitoring samples must be collected at least 14 days apart, And finally, sensors must be calibrated as specified by the manufacturer, but no less than annually. So that's a quick summary of the monitoring requirements. Hopefully you're aware of how those apply to your vessel, but I want to stress you do need to read the permit and figure out exactly what applies. And again, if you have questions, you can send them to the email address shown below and on every other page. As a reminder, the annual report requirements are in Appendix H of the permit, which begins on page 181 of the permit. There's also a supplemental addendum for ballast water treatment systems. That addendum's on the 4th page of the annual report. But the DMR requirements that I'm going to talk about today begin on the 5th page of that form, or page 185 of the permit. The first DMRs are for ballast water, and as I just mentioned, includes information for functional monitoring, biological monitoring, and biocide monitoring. And I'll be discussing each of these in more detail, but for now, just kind of want to give you a quick reminder of the basis for the electronic DMR. Periodic exhaust gas scrubber wash water monitoring is presented on this page, and again, as you can see, the long list of parameters required to be monitored. Continuous monitoring requirements for exhaust gas scrubber. Next page, the gray water monitoring requirements. And then finally, on page 189 of the permit, the bilge water monitoring requirements. When the term DMR is used, pages 185 through 189 are the DMR requirements that are being talked about. And with that, I want to get your input on a few questions to get a sense of your interests and needs specific to the DMRs. As a reminder, we'll have a couple breaks for questions, but for now, I want to kind of give you a little more of an overview of the DMR portion. So for the poll questions, you should see it's popped up. You can click on the button to answer, and let me read the question, then you can pick the answer, and then we'll get a summary of the responses. So the first question is, for approximately how many vessels do you have to submit DMR data in the 2014 annual report? The choices are none, 1 to 3, 4 to 10, 11 to 25, or more than 25. So if you can click on the answer, and then Sarah will pop up the results and give us a sense of kind of what the audience has.
Yeah, so we had about 65% of the vote in, and 53% of you said 0, 28% said 1 to 3, 11% said 4 to 10, 7% said more than 25, and then 2% said 11 to 25.
Okay. All right, well, it's interesting that over half of you don't have to submit DMRs. Maybe you're just on behalf of someone else who does, or maybe the past 10 minutes you figured out you didn't have to submit them, but hopefully this will still be useful for you. The second question is, will you be submitting any DMR data for exhaust gas scrubber wash water discharges? Choices are no, yes for one vessel, yes for more than one vessel, or I don't know. We're looking for your answer to this question, that when we wrote the permit, we really were aware of very few vessels equipped with exhaust gas scrubbers, but we're, for a variety of reasons, aware that their use is increasing, so really more of an interest to see if any of you out there are actually going to be submitting data for that technology this year.
And again, with about 65% of you entering your poll results, we had 88% say no, 5% say yes for more than one vessel. 5% of you also didn't know. And then we had 2% that said yes, but only for one vessel.
Okay. Well, it's good to see that there are some people that will be discharging or reporting that information. We have a few slides at the end where I'll go through kind of the requirements for that. But again, we expected probably the fewest number of people would be submitting that data. And then the third question, and read this carefully, we're limited to the number of responses that we can have on a question, so it's limited to 5, so I kind of had to mix and match. But the question is, other than exhaust gas scrubber wash water, for which types of discharges will you be submitting DMR data? And let me say, if you're not submitting DMR data, you don't have to answer this question. The answer, the choices are ballast water only, bilge water or gray water, but not ballast water, bilge water and gray water, but not ballast water and either bilge water or gray water, or all three, ballast, bilge, and gray water. And the numbers in parentheses next to the choices kind of how many of the different types of discharges you'll be submitting data for. So we'll wait for a second and see the responses.
Okay, and we have about 30% of you reporting right now, so I'm going to go ahead and close because I know some of you weren't going to respond to that. So you'll see 44% we had ballast water only. Next we had 36% was all three, ballast, bilge, and gray water. After that we had 12% with bilge or gray water, but not ballast water. And then we had 8% say ballast water and either bilge water or gray water. And none of you said bilge water and gray water, but not ballast water.
Okay. Great. Well, based on that, it looks like those of you that have to submit data, almost all of you will be submitting, 88% of you will be submitting ballast water. So fortunately, one of the examples we're going to walk through has ballast water, and it should hopefully be helpful for you. So I appreciate your responses, and I'm going to go through a few more slides, and then we'll take some of the questions that you've submitted so far. So let's now move into using the ENOI system to actually submit those DMRs. I'm not going to walk through how to register and log in. We discussed that during the last webinar. But if you still are not sure, from the main page, you can click on the help link in the top right corner of the login screen for more information on how to do that. And recall that once you log in, you have two options to click on to go to the annual report DMR portion of the system as shown on this slide, either the link on the top or the button on the side. And then once on the annual report DMR page, as with all pages, I recommend you reading the text in the body of the system for some guidance and tips. But for those of you that are actually submitting DMR data, there's only one option within the system for doing so, because the type of information to be submitted is so complex. The only approach that's available is the spreadsheet option, which we call the batch submission. So you'll have to click on the Prepare Batch Annual Reports button to go to the part of the system that allows you to begin to prepare those reports. So once on that page, again, read the text for instructions and tips. But to begin preparing the annual report with the DMR data, you'll have to download the appropriate spreadsheet. You can do that by clicking on the first button circle that says Batch Annual Report Spreadsheet with DMRs. The second circle is where you can download an example spreadsheet that's been completed to show you what the spreadsheet should look like when you're done. If you find yourself confused when you're preparing your annual report, you may want to return to this page and download that example. When you click on the Batch Annual Report Spreadsheet with DMR button, the spreadsheet will begin downloading, and it may be different on different computers, but for me, it shows up in the bottom left-hand corner where the computer shows that it's downloading and the progress that's been made. And then once that file is completely downloaded, you can click on it to open it and save it into your personal directory. I will say that file is approximately 30 meg in size, so it's a fairly large file. We've yet to have anyone have a problem downloading it. When we've been trying to help some folks, we've been trying to send it back and forth through emails. We've had some people that have had problems emailing it to us, and so we recently set up an alternative way to be able to share. If you get halfway through your spreadsheet and need help, we have an approach that you can send the file to a site that we can then view and get back to you on. So again, if you run into those types of problems through the email box, we can help you out with that. So once the file is downloaded and you open it, you'll come to the Instructions tab. A few important points. You will probably see a warning at the top of the screen telling you that macros have been disabled. You'll have to click on that button to enable the macros. Also, you'll see a Generate XML button near the top of the page. And once you've completed entering data on the spreadsheet, that's where you'll come back to and click the Generate XML button to create the actual file that you'll then be sending to EPA. Notice at the bottom of the page, the spreadsheet contains many different colored tabs. Depending on what version of Excel you use, they may look slightly different, but the colors should be generally the same. Notice the yellow questions tab, brown ballast tanks tab. You can scroll through all those tabs using the arrows on the left-hand corner, in the bottom left-hand corner of the page. And for this spreadsheet with DMRs, there actually are 21 different tabs on this spreadsheet. For DMR data, these are the tabs that you may be using, and these are the tabs that aren't on the spreadsheet for annual reports without DMRs. There are 5 ballast water data tabs, 4 exhaust gas scrubber tabs, 1 bilge water tab, and 2 gray water tabs. And I'll go through each of those in a little bit. To answer the bulk of the annual report questions, you should know that you'll be clicking on the yellow questions tab. That tab walks through the questions on the annual report, and then based on your responses, will direct you to any additional tabs that you'll have to complete. For example, as you work your way through the questions, most of those questions will be blue on the spreadsheet, but eventually you'll come to questions that are a different color. Those are questions that, depending on your answer, may require you to complete additional tabs on the spreadsheet. The color of the question matches the tab or tabs that you have to complete. And as a reminder, when using the spreadsheet, recall there may be dependencies identified at the top of the row as to whether or not that question must be answered for a vessel. There's help text available for every question that you can view simply by holding your cursor over that question. And finally, there are certain formatting requirements for each cell that must be followed. For example, many questions have drop-down menus that require you to select one of the options from a list. And as one final reminder, each question may have a red asterisk or a black asterisk next to it. A red asterisk requires that you answer that question for each vessel. A black asterisk requires that you answer that question depending on your answer to a previous question. A question without an asterisk is a question that you don't have to answer to complete the spreadsheet, although there may be questions that don't have asterisks that the permit does require you to provide. And so with that, let's take a break and answer some of your questions. My colleague, Praveen Rana, has been reading over the comments, questions submitted so far. He's going to read a few of those and provide a response. And so he's going to wander over and give it to Praveen.
Yes. Hello. This is Praveen Rana. I work with Jack Faulk on the system. And I have a handful of questions, mostly related to applicability. They're kind of related. Actually, my response is going to be related. One is if you use potable water for ballast water through the regulation supply. And another one is related to the majority of the systems don't have ballast water treatment systems installed yet. What's the applicability for those? Questions like that, they're addressed in the permit. We recommend you consult the permit for that, or send us an email to the VGP help desk. So we'll be able to respond precisely at vgp@epa.gov.
Yeah, this is Jack. Let me just let you know, and I will show you at the end, but there are two different emails. The VGP ENOI one is for really these system monitoring related questions, anything having to do with eligibility, applicability, if you have questions on EALs or anything else within the permit, really sending those questions to the VGP@EPA.gov mailbox. You should get an answer. A lot of the questions that I see are kind of so specific to eligibility, and we really weren't planning on answering those today. So, Praveen?
Yes, there's actually one question that's actually tied to the spreadsheet. Again, send us the applicability questions to the help desk, and we'd be happy to answer those. And there's one question one gentleman has. When filling out the batch spreadsheet, for example, when filling out the ballast tanks, for each ship that tank list will be more than one row. Therefore, when we are filling out the batch report, how are we to submit for multiple ships with multiple tanks? Does that mean that, for example, ship X will take up row 6, 10, and so on? So, do you want to take that?
Yeah, let me. So, on that tab in particular, you know, if you have, say, 3 vessels and it says how many ballast tanks do you have, and you say I have 5 ballast tanks on each vessel, on that questions tab, those would be the first 3 rows. Well, since you have 5 ballast tanks for each, you're going to have to actually report those 15 ballast tanks on the ballast tank tab. I think that's 2. And so, yeah, 6 through 10 would be the 5 tanks for the first vessel, 11 through 15 would be for the second vessel, and whatever it was, 16 through 20 would be for the third vessel. So where the different vessels appear on the different spreadsheets or different worksheets within the spreadsheet don't matter. I know a lot of people question, if I had data in row 6 for vessel 1, do I have to put data for vessel 1 in row 6 in every other tab? And the answer is no, you don't. As long as the information's there, that's fine.
Yeah, there's one more question. It says, if we have permanent ballast, I think it says, and not discharging, shall we keep recording DMR without any writings? That means you don't have any discharge at all. In general, you may not need to collect the DMR data, but please send that question again to the help desk so we can respond more precisely and get, figure out exactly what the situation is.
Yeah, again, if you don't discharge ballast water and water is subject to the permit, you don't have to monitor ballast water, at least under our permit. So yeah, I think that's it. We've got a few other more specific questions, and my guess is as we get into the details of the DMR part of the spreadsheet, you may have additional questions, but I think we're going to and move on. As I mentioned, I'm going to walk through 3 examples and how the spreadsheet should be completed for each. First example is where no DMR data are required. Second is where DMR data are required for gray water, and the third is DMR data required for ballast water. In example 1, we have a cargo ship constructed on July 1, 2010 at 75,000 gross tons with a crew of 25. Vessel discharged gray water and bilge water in U.S. waters. Vessel has both bilge water and gray water treatment systems, but not a ballast water treatment system, nor does the vessel operate an exhaust gas scrubber. Also, vessel does not operate in the Great Lakes. So question is, what monitoring applies to this vessel that needs to be reported on a DMR? And kind of as I mentioned, no bilge water monitoring is required because it was not built after December 19th, 2013, i.e. not a new build. Similarly, no gray water monitoring is required because it's not a new build vessel, it didn't operate in the Great Lakes, and it's not a cruise ship. No exhaust gas scrubber monitoring is required because the vessel doesn't operate such a system. And finally, no ballast water monitoring is required because the vessel doesn't have a ballast water treatment system. So bottom line for this vessel, not required to monitor, and likewise not required to provide DMR data as part of their annual report. How's that look on the annual report spreadsheet? Answers to the ballast water and exhaust gas scrubber questions in column AG and AL are no. So based on the help text, the user doesn't have to complete the DMR tabs for ballast water and exhaust gas scrubber wash water. Also, if you scroll out further on the questions tab, since the vessel doesn't have to collect bilge water or gray water data, these answers are also no. Note though that you're still required to report certain information about discharges, whether you have to monitor or not. For example, you're required to provide information about any gray water treatment system on board the vessel, even if you're not required to monitor. So in this example, the user can prepare the annual report without having to provide any monitoring data. All right, so now let's get into DMR examples. In this example, it's a cargo ship that's new, constructed after December 19th, 2013. Discharges gray water and water subject to the permit. The other conditions are similar to example 1. Because this vessel is new and has a crew capacity of at least 15 and the overnight accommodations for that crew, according to Part 22.15.2 of the permit, the vessel is required to perform gray water monitoring. So, on the questions tab of the annual report spreadsheet, when you get to column BD, you'll answer yes, that you are subject to gray water analytical monitoring requirements, and then if you perform such monitoring, in column BE. As shown, if you answer yes, you're required to go to tab 10A that you'll see at the bottom of the spreadsheet. And this is the extent of information required on tab 10A. The tab includes basic information about when and where the samples were collected. In this example, we filled in the cells to show what it would look like. First, you have to select the vessel from a drop-down list of vessels that you entered on the yellow questions tab. You'll have to enter one row of information for each sample collected. In this example, the vessel is reporting two samples as shown by the 2 sample numbers in column B. Each vessel for which you said you collected monitoring data in column BE of the yellow questions tab, you'll have to have at least one row of data for that vessel in this tab. In this case, the vessel is required to collect and analyze 2 samples per year, so 2 samples are shown. Next, you to provide a brief description of the gray water treatment unit from which samples are being collected, or if no treatment unit, indicating such. Next, enter the date the sampling event took place, and then whether the sample was collected while the vessel was in U.S. waters. Note that these samples don't have to be collected when in U.S. waters, but if a discharge will be discharged in gray water in U.S. waters, samples are required to be collected at some point during the calendar year. Next, you provide a brief description of where the sample was collected. Like in this example, the location was identified as Port Wastewater Discharge 1. Finally, you'll need to enter the latitude and longitude of the vessel when the sample was collected, and that's it for tab 10A. The results of the monitoring for those two samples identified in 10A are to be provided on tab 10B. Let's take a look at 10B. Column A, it's the same drop-down list of vessels. Should match the vessels that you have sampling information to report that you showed in tab 10A. Notice here that the drop-down menu, when you select a vessel, actually populates 10 rows with that vessel name, which those are the 10 rows of the potential pollutants that you have to monitor for gray water. Column B is the same sample number you entered in tab 10A. At this point, it will show up on a drop-down menu, so you can pick that. Again, it will show up for the entire 10 rows of potential pollutants that you have to provide monitoring data for. Column C are the pollutants that you may have to monitor for. It's derived from the list in the permit, and you have to provide data in each row for those pollutants for which you have to monitor. The system is set up that if you say you have a sample, you have to provide data for at least one of these pollutants. The permit may actually require you to report data for all 10, but we didn't want to limit the system if somebody neglected to monitor for, say, 4 of the pollutants to not be able to still submit their report. So you have to submit at least one. In many instances, you may be submitting most or all of those pollutants. Column D is to identify whether the pollutant for that sample was below the detection limit or below the quantitation limit. If the pollutant was found in a measurable amount, the column should be left blank. See how in this example there's one instance for sample 1 and 2 instances for sample 2 where the pollutant was not detected. Column E is where you'll enter the results of the monitoring. And let me bounce ahead to column H. That's where you'll present the units for the results. Units have, on this tab, have a drop-down menu based on the type of pollutant to be monitored. So you'll identify the units for the result that you provide in column E. Columns F and G apply to any if-influent concentrations for BOD and TSS. Those certain cruise ship monitoring will have that information to be able to demonstrate compliance with secondary treatment requirements as specified in the permit. This example shows how you would fill in that information, even though for this example for cargo ships that information is not required. Column I is for you to identify the analytical method used for each pollutant. Note the permit specifies what methods are allowable, with many of the methods being as referenced in the federal regulations at Title 40, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 136, which we often call 40 CFR Part 136. And then finally, you report the date the sample was analyzed for each specific pollutant. And that's it for gray water monitoring. Again, pay attention to the red and black asterisks as to whether data is required in each column. Note that for DMRs, in many instances, a column may not be required in the system, but the permit actually requires that information to be provided. Again, this was done as a way to ensure you could still submit the bulk of your data, even if you may have been missing one or two pieces of the required information. So that was a gray water example. Now let's look at a more complicated example. In this one, the vessel has installed a ballast water treatment system, so is required to also perform ballast water monitoring. Again, on the questions tab, by answering yes in column AH of that tab, this vessel is now required to provide DMR data in the annual report, beginning with tab 7A. Note, though, that by answering yes in column AG, the vessel also has to enter data for tabs 3A and 3B and potentially 3C. There are actually 9 tabs in the spreadsheet specific to ballast water. Tab 2 is where you'll identify each ballast tank on the vessel. And again, as I mentioned, if you have an annual report with multiple vessels, you'll have one row on tab 2 for each ballast tank for each vessel. So if you have 10 tanks with 10 vessels with 10 tanks, you will have 100 rows of information on tab 2. Tab 3A is where you'll provide information on ballast water treatment. Tab 3B is to identify the type of technology employed for that treatment. Tab 3C is to identify any flag administrations that type approved the ballast water treatment system. And then the DMR information are the next 5 tabs. 7A is where you'll identify the months of ballast water discharges in U.S. waters. Tab 7B is for providing functional monitoring results. Tab 7C is for providing details of the samples that are collected for biological and biocide monitoring. And then tab 7D is where you will provide the results of the biological monitoring, and 7E is where you'll provide the results of the biocide monitoring. So a quick look at tab 3A for the ballast water treatment system basically shows the same questions that were asked in the addendum of Appendix H of the permit. As I've mentioned in previous webinars, the language and order of the questions may be slightly different in the paper version. We did that really as a way to be more consistent with how information is reported electronically and to kind of clarify it for the users. This tab is basically for information about any ballast water treatment system on board a vessel. If you have more than one treatment system on a vessel, you have to fill out one row for each treatment system. If you submit annual reports for 10 vessels and only one of them has a ballast water treatment system, you will only have one row of information on tab 3A. If you indicate in column G that the system is type approved, you're required to complete the information in tab 3C, and I'll show you that in a second. But tab 3B simply asks for the type of ballast water treatment. Probably worth mentioning that the system description in column B will be a pick list from the descriptions you provided on tab 3A. So you'll simply want to select the treatment system from the drop-down menu. For this example, we have an ozone system, and I've noted such with an X in the column. If your specific treatment type isn't listed, put an X in column U, and then enter that other technology type in column V. And then, as I mentioned, tab 3C simply asks you to identify any flag administrations that have type approved the treatment system if you indicated such in tab 3A. So now we're up to the tabs where you begin to enter information about your monitoring events for ballast water. These really are the tabs known as the DMR information. Recall that if you answered yes to the question in the main tab that you collected analytical monitoring data for ballast water, you'd provide those data in the light blue tabs 7A through 7E. Here's tab 7A for our example. On this tab, you'd identify the months that the vessel discharged ballast water is subject to the permit. Again, select the ballast water treatment system descriptor from a drop-down menu based on what you provided in tab 3B. And then in this example, again, the vessel discharged in U.S. waters for the first 4 months of the year. So those are identified in the columns C through F. And that's all that goes in tab 7A. Tab 7B is where you enter the functional monitoring results for ballast water treatment systems. And let me stress that I believe this is going to be the trickiest of all the tabs on the spreadsheet. If you recall, the permit requires vessels with ballast water treatment systems to monitor and report data on the physical and chemical performance characteristics of the treatment system. So here in column C, you'll identify the technology type from a drop-down list consistent with the technologies identified in tab 3B. The type of treatment that you use dictates what parameters you must measure to demonstrate system functionality. The list of parameters for each treatment type is presented in Appendix J of the permit. So before we go through the rest of 7B, let's take a look at Appendix J. So this is the first page of Appendix J that shows the different types of ballast water treatment types and the types of measurements to be conducted and what's required to be reported. The last column dictates what's to be reported on the DMR for each of the different technology types. The second page of Appendix J includes ozone treatment. You can see that the last column indicates several parameters that must be measured and reported. In this case, it's total residual oxidizer readings, ozone readings from both online sensors if used and sample analysis, bromate measurements, conductivity/salinity, and temperature. So getting back to tab 7B, depending on the technology you identify in column C, you'll get a list of the applicable parameters in column D. So here, for ozone, there are 6 different parameters for which you're required to provide data, which correspond to the parameters in that Appendix J. For each month of discharge, you're to identify the number of monitoring events, the minimum value, the maximum value, and the average value. If these parameters are monitored continuously, you can enter the word continuous as the frequency. And again, that will be in the help text for that question by holding your cursor over the question. For this example, you'd be expected to enter data for January through April and for each of the 6 parameters associated with ozone treatment. Column E is available to provide any necessary text that you may need to further clarify the parameters measured. For example, if you monitor a parameter at more than one location, you may want to differentiate the location in this column. Column F are for the units for reporting the data. Column G is the measurement method, which is a pick list of options, such as sensor, chemical analysis, count, design, etc. If the measurement method isn't on the pick list, you can select Other and then enter that method in column H. Column I is where you identify the system design operating range for the parameter reported in the row. For example, if the system is designed to operate between certain concentrations, you should identify that range of concentrations here. If there's not an operating range for a parameter, you can put not applicable in this cell. You can see in this example we entered data for 2 parameters for 2 months. To complete this, we would enter data for all 6 parameters in column D for the 4 months the vessel discharged in U.S. waters. For those of you that have to monitor ballast water, my guess is you'll probably agree with me that this is going to be the trickiest and most time-consuming tab in the entire spreadsheet. The next tab, tab 7C, is for you to enter information about samples that you've collected for biological and biocide monitoring. You'll have to assign a unique sample number for each and then provide basics of where those samples were collected. As shown for this example, a total of 7 samples were collected, 2 for biological monitoring, 3 for initial biocide monitoring, and 2 for biocide maintenance monitoring. Tab 7D is fairly straightforward. You'll select the sample number, again, from a drop-down list that's created from the previous tab, and then enter biological monitoring data for those parameters for which you're required to monitor. For this, the list of parameters is pre-populated with just 3, as those are the only parameters for which biological monitoring may be required. And let me add that for this tab, the permit specifies the type of analytical method that has to be used for each of those 3 parameters. So the column G actually is a drop-down menu where you will actually pick which analytical method you use for your monitoring. And then finally, ballast water is tab, or the final ballast water tab is 7E, is for biocide monitoring results. In this tab, the list of parameters and biocide types is fixed. You should enter results for those parameters for which you're required to monitor. In this example, the vessel uses ozone treatment. So if you look at column D, you'll see that there are 5 different parameters that are to be monitored for ozone treatment with the results of those monitoring entered. Pay close attention to column D. See here how for certain parameters more than one type of biocide may require monitoring. So if you look for ozone, you'll see that total residual oxidizers actually is required for chlorine, chlorine dioxide, and ozone. Total for halomethanes is for the same 3 biocides. Haloacetic acid is for the same 3, but bromate and bromoform are only required to be monitored for those of you that use ozone biocide. In this example, this actually shows 2 different samples that are collected. So the same batch of parameters are listed twice, and then you can see the values, units, analytical method, and analysis date are all entered for those 5 parameters for which ozone is the biocide used. And unlike the previous tab here, because there's a wider range of approved analytical methods, it's left as a text box for you to type in the method that you use to monitor those specific parameters. And that's the extent of ballast water DMR information in the spreadsheet, and that would be the end of example number 3. But now, just want to spend a few minutes walking through the bilge water and exhaust gas scrubber tabs. Bilge water tab's probably the easiest DMR to complete. If you have bilge water monitoring data to report, these are the cells shown on the screen that you need to complete the report. In many instances, you'll be required to monitor your discharge once a year and report that information. So for each vessel for which you report these data, you'll identify the vessel name, assign a sample number, describe the bilge water treatment system, and then provide the details about the sampling. Reporting the results is similar to gray water, although it's just for one pollutant, oil and grease. For that one pollutant, though, you are required to report results obtained both from sample collection and analysis, as well as the reading of the oil content meter at the time that sample was collected. All bilge water monitoring data for one sample for one vessel can go on one line in the spreadsheet. Hopefully the information on this tab is easy to understand and complete. Reporting exhaust gas scrubber wash water monitoring results is entered on 4 different tabs, 8A through 8B. Information on these 4 tabs has been moved around a little more than some of the other tabs from the paper form, really to make the reporting of the information clearer, easier, and to minimize the duplication of reporting information. Tab 8A is similar to the ballast water monitoring tab. Here, you report the months that you discharged this waste into U.S. waters. The bottom half of that slide, tab 8B, contains information about the exhaust gas treatment system and some of the probe readings at the time of sampling. On this tab, each row represents one treatment system. So if a vessel has one exhaust gas treatment system, there will be one row of data on this tab. Tab 8C is where you'll report the analytical results of sampling performed on exhaust gas scrubber wash water. Columns A through E allow you to enter one value in each to represent the entire sample for that system or that vessel. Recall that for exhaust gas scrubbers, you're required to monitor in 3 places. To report that information, you'll select one of the sample types from column D. You can see the drop-down menu, and then enter the information for all these parameters for that sample type. You'll then go to the next, which is below, I guess beginning on row 40, and enter information for the second sample type. So reasonably, the first 30 plus rows will be your inlet data, the second 30 plus rows will be your post-scrubber data, and your third 30 rows will be the discharge data from the vessel. So for the one scrubber sampling event, you'd expect to fill in about 90 rows of information. And you'll note the sample event number for this. For all 3 of those, they would have the same sample event number. So it would be sample event 1 inlet, sample event 1 post-scrubber, sample event 1 discharge. So if you do have to submit scrubber information, there is a fair number of pollutants that do have to be monitored and reported here. And then finally, tab 8D is where you report the results of continuous monitoring for the 4 parameters as required for exhaust gas scrubber wash water. Have to report the minimum, maximum, and average values for each month of discharge in U.S. waters. And that's it. That's the extent of DMR information on the spreadsheet. As a refresher, once you've completed entry of all the data on the spreadsheet, you have to return to the Instructions tab and click the Generate XML button to generate the XML file that you'll then upload to the ENOI system. A couple of notes on where you may see error messages when using the spreadsheet. First error is the type of message you may get when you try to enter data in a field that's in a different format than required. That message will pop up immediately when trying to enter the data. for example, if you're trying to put text into a date field. Second type of message is if the XML file does not generate because of an improperly completed spreadsheet. In this example, the error message is telling you that there's an error in cell 6B on the Questions tab. You can then go to that cell, figure out what's wrong, fix it, and any similar problems that you may see, and then rerun the XML generator. And again, it may find another error. Again, it progresses its way through the spreadsheet, and each time it finds a single error, it pops up an error. So it may take a number of XML runs, although it's fairly quick in doing those runs. But eventually you should get a successful XML file created that you can then save on your computer for uploading to the ENOI system. And then once the XML file is generated, you'll return to the ENOI system and go to the Prepare Batch Annual Reports button shown in the circle here. You'll click on that, and it'll take you to that page, and if you scroll down that page, you'll see the template that you use to submit the annual report. And so you'll select Annual Report DMR, select the calendar year 2014, choose the name of the owner-operator, and then you'll browse down at the bottom. It'll pre-populate all those fields for the owner-operator, and then you'll browse to find the newly created XML file, and then click the Upload button to upload the file to EPA. Once you do that, the system will give you an Upload Pending status notice. You can scroll down that page a little, and you'll see a refresh button that you can click on, and generally within about 5 to 15 seconds you'll either get a failed or successful notice as the status. Here you can see it says successful. If it says fail, there will be an error log that you can click on that will give you a reason for the failure. In some instances, it will be easier to understand what is wrong in the spreadsheet. You can then go back, revise the spreadsheet, regenerate the XML, and then submit, re-upload that file. If you have problems not understanding the error message, you can send a message again to the VGP ENOI box, and either Praveen or I will get back to you. I can say that I know I personally expect to spend a vast majority of my time between now and February 28th helping folks, making sure that you get your annual reports completed accurately and on time. So if you do have problems, please send us a message. Again, well, once it's successfully uploaded, then you have to certify those reports, and so you'll go and click the Batch Certify button, Batch Certify Reports button, and that's to be done by the person identified on the spreadsheet as the certifier. And one thing that we've had an issue with is on the spreadsheet you're including an email address of that certifier. The person that then has to certify the reports has to have registered in our system with that same email address. So it could be the same person, but if he has multiple emails, you have to be certain that the one identified on the spreadsheet matches the email address of the one that he's now using to attempt to certify those reports. That'll take you to the list of, once you've clicked that, it'll take you to the list of annual reports ready to be certified. You can click on the box in the top left. It's kind of obscured by that one arrow, which will select all the reports, or you can go down and click on individual reports if you want to certify them, not all at a time. Each page in this will contain up to 100 reports, which is the maximum you can certify at a time. You can actually submit up to 5,000 annual reports at a time on a single spreadsheet. but it'll still be limited to certifying those 100 at a time. More than that was slowing down the system and causing the system to time out, so that kind of prevents the problems from occurring. If you do need to revise an annual report before you certify it, you'll have to make revisions on the spreadsheet, regenerate the XML, and then re-upload the file. So, strongly suggest that you make sure your spreadsheet information is correct before you submit it. But if you don't do it that way, it's not that big of a deal to go back and edit the spreadsheet and basically resubmit all of that. If you do that before you actually submit the reports that you want to change, you personally can go in and delete the draft annual reports. Once you submit an annual report, certified and submitted, you can no longer delete it. You can submit a second report, but that first report remains in the system. If for some reason you do need to have it deleted, you can, again, send an email to the VGP at ENOI email box, and we can have our contractors delete that for you. And once you do that, any certified annual reports will now show up on the main annual report page of the ENOI system. You can view that report by clicking on the PDF. The preparer and certifier of the annual reports also receive an email notification that the reports have been submitted, along with a link to a page where all those submitted annual reports can be viewed and downloaded. And that is it. I did mention there are a few places you can go for additional questions. Remember, read the, there's the help text on the registration or login page. There's text on each page in the system. There's help text for each question in the spreadsheet. But if you still need assistance, you can send an email to vgp.enoi@epa.gov. If you have a question about the permit itself rather than the system or monitoring, reporting DMR type information, you can send that to the second email, vgp@epa.gov. There is a web link there that is actually the page that has some additional ENOI help text. It's also the page where this webinar, last week's webinar, and the original ENOI webinar from late 2013 are going to be posted. The two previous webinars, as I mentioned, hopefully will be posted by the end of this week, and then today's webinar I expect will be posted on that site probably within a week or two, but there will actually be a link where you can view the recording through the hosting site immediately. And with that, that's the end of the formal presentation, but we have time to answer a few of your questions, and going to bring Praveen back over to read those and provide some input.
Yes, again, a lot of the questions were related to applicability. For example, again, we have vessels who have not yet installed ballast water treatment systems, and questions like that, yes, they are addressed in the permit. There's a table that discusses timing and vessel size and so on and so forth. So as far as applicability, we do prefer you contact us at that vgp@enoi.gov. The reason is not because we're trying to avoid these questions, but it may take a couple of back and forth between us to get exactly what you're asking, and we want to provide as precise an answer as possible because they're tied to applicability. So the next question then, so again, for applicability, questions about the permit, etc., please contact that and we'll be happy to help you. There are two questions I want to address, though, related to the system. The first one is, if submitting DMR data does not apply, exactly what annual reporting is required required. There are actually, again, Jack said there are two spreadsheets. There's one where a much shorter version, a lot fewer tabs, that's used to report to fill in data for your annual report where there's no DMR data required. But just keep in mind that even if one of your vessels has DMR data, you have to use the longer spreadsheet. And in that spreadsheet, you can also mix in vessels that do not have DMR data, but you cannot go the other way. In other words, the short spreadsheet is just exclusively for those vessels that do not have DMR data to report, and the questions are all in there. The second question is, how can the public gain access to the permits, DMRs, and annual reports?
Yeah, and let me just, I pulled up a web page. This is the main NPDES vessels page. I don't know if you were paying attention, but if you go to www.epa.gov, and then this is the NPDES program /NPDES, it takes you to our main permitting page, and we'll send out this link to folks. But in the right-hand margin, it has all the different program areas, and it has vessel discharges that if you click on it, kind of talks about, why these vessels need permits and the different type of permits and so forth. And there's a tab or a link over on the right side under Vessel General Permit called ENOI. And if you click on that, I think I mentioned the page, and this is where the webinar information is going to be provided. But if you look where my cursor is, there's this Vessels ENOI search that if you click on, it takes you down to the page, and actually the old permit as well as the new permit NOI information is available. And if you click on that, this provides you to a page where you can search for NOIs, and we recently added a feature where you can search for annual reports as well. And so quickly, let me just show you. So here, you can pick NOIs, and then if I want to click include only vessels that submitted an annual report for this year, I can do that. And then you can pick, any other. There's a whole host of criteria that you can select, and then you can hit search, and this generally takes 5 or so seconds. Hopefully it'll have, yeah. So then this will give you the full list of vessels that submitted NOIs under the 2013 permit that have submitted an annual report. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can actually see the total, and there so far have been 4,819 vessels that have submitted annual reports that also submitted NOIs. As some of you probably remember, even vessels that didn't submit an NOI, that had to submit or had to prepare a PERI form, still have to submit an annual report. And so you can actually select PERI, and let me see who has submitted an annual report that submitted a PERI form, and you can see there have been 98 vessels that have done that. And so within the system, whether you did it through the PERI or whatever, you can click on Actions, and there's this download button, which you can then download basically all the NOI information that has shown up in the search result. And while this table only shows about 10 rows, the download actually has almost all the NOI information included in it. So you can get all the NOI data in a spreadsheet. If you want the annual report information, we've not yet made that available in spreadsheet form, but again, I selected it. If you then click on a specific tracking number, it pulls up a list, and since these were PERI vessels, they didn't have to submit an NOI. If this was an NOI vessel, it would have one table that had their NOI information, the second table that has their annual report. And so here is the annual report for this Maersk vessel. And if you click on the PDF, I've not done this on this computer, and it's not my computer, so hopefully it works. But it'll actually pull up a PDF version of that annual report for that vessel. So you can search for NOIs for any vessel. You can search for details of those annual reports. So if you want to see only the cargo ships, there's a search criteria, and it doesn't look like this computer is working for the PDF. But for the annual reports, really you're limited to this box. And then it also says, well, how many vessels have actually submitted DMR data? So we just had this presentation on DMRs, and everybody's confused. And so you can see, well, who's actually made their way through the system. And this is kind of interesting because so far it shows 3 vessels. But if you look at it, one of the 3 is fake. It was I guess somebody just tested it out to see if they could figure out how to use the system. So there are really 2 vessels that have submitted their annual reports. Again, here's one that had NOI. They had an NOI, they had an NOT, they resubmitted another NOI, and then at the bottom they submitted an annual report. Here they did that a week ago, and then if you click on the PDF, if you have Adobe Reader properly installed, you'll be able to see the paper copy of that annual report. So again, we'll send out the link, but if you go to www.epa.gov and /NPDES, which is the type of permit that this is, that'll take you to the main page, and then you can find the NOI search tool. Long-winded answer to a short question. I'll go back to Praveen.
No, that was pretty much it. So again, contact us. We'll work with you.
Yeah, I just on one that there was a question about, do we have to re-enter the information? Couldn't it be just pre-populated? And we're working for next year's annual report. So if you submit data for 100 ballast water tanks on this year's annual report, we're hoping that for next year's annual report, it will give you an option to basically copy that information from the last report. I would strongly suggest, though, that you keep your Excel spreadsheet from this year. Probably would be a good basis for creating next year's report. But there's certain information that if you submit it on the NOI, you don't have to submit in the annual report. So where we ask for the vessel construction date, the length, the tonnage, if you submitted that on the NOI, the system will actually pre-populate that in the annual report. The thing it won't pre-populate is some of the questions about, do you have a treatment system, and if so, describe it. It's such a fluid part of the program that we really expect that what was reported in the NOI will very likely be different come the first and second and third annual reports. So for this first annual report, it's not set up to allow that information to be pre-populated, but it's definitely something that we're going to try and figure out how to do it for next year's annual report. And I'm just looking, there's a few very specific questions. I mean, we'll say that we've gotten a lot more questions on the ENOI mailbox, and I think we've been a little slow for the past few days trying to respond. I know I wasn't getting to them, and then Monday was a holiday here, and being that this is an international permit, we get questions Saturday, Sunday, holidays, Christmas Day, New Year's Day. It really doesn't matter. Stuff comes into us, but from this point forward, I know the two of us really are going to do our hardest to be able to respond to any of the questions that you send to us, and really that VGP ENOI at EPA.gov is the best way to communicate with us. And so I think with that, looking at some of the other questions, again, if you have a very specific applicability, eligibility question, if you want to send it to us, and we can get back to you on that. But otherwise, I appreciate your participation. You'll get an email that will have a link to this webinar. It will be posted within a couple weeks, so you can download a PDF, a transcript, and then in a different format. It's easier to work your way through the audio, video portion of it. And I think with that, we're going to end it and say thank you very much and good luck with preparing your DMRs and annual reports. And then I think Sarah is going to just kind of give a few last comments about the survey and what you need to do or not need to do before you log out.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Thank you all again for participating today and being with us. We do have a quick survey at the end, which will pop up on your screen as soon as I shut down the webinar, and we do ask that you submit responses there. If you have any additional questions, anything like that, you can also submit using that survey, but your feedback is important to us in planning these webinars. So we appreciate that, and this concludes today's webinar.